It began with the chill wind rolling off the Atlantic. The sky hung low like a sheet of gray glass. A police officer walked his dog along the dunes of Gilgo Beach. He was not expecting to find anything, only helping in the search for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert. But the dog would not stop pulling at the leash, its nose pressed against the sand, its tail stiff, as if pointing to a secret. When the officer brushed the grass aside, he saw white. Not seashell, white. Not driftwood, bone, half buried in the cold sand. He called for backup. By the time the first cruiser arrived, the tide had turned. The beach fell silent except for the wind. Detectives began to mark the area with orange flags. Each flag a question, each question another ache in the stomach. By sunset, they had, years later, new officers would join the force, not realizing how deep the story ran. They would learn about it during training. They would drive that same highway and glance toward the dunes. And they would wonder how someone could do something so cruel and still go home like nothing happened. Even now, the ocean keeps washing against that shore. Every wave a whisper from the past. Every breeze carrying the same cold question. How many more are still waiting beneath the sand? If you are still here listening, stay with us. The story is only beginning. For more than a decade, the case slept under paper and dust. Files stacked in basements. Evidence boxes marked with fading numbers. Each detective who touched the case left with the same feeling. Too many leads and not enough proof. Then came a new task force. Fresh eyes. Sharper tools. They reopened every file, every photograph, every phone record. This time, they looked at the data differently. Not as chaos, but as a pattern waiting to be drawn. They built digital maps of every phone ping along Ocean Parkway. Dots of light that blinked like stars across the screen. One cluster stood out. A group of calls that always appeared near the same neighborhood. A quiet street in Massapequa Park. There lived a man named Rex Hoyerman, an architect, a husband, a father. He took the train to Manhattan each morning. He designed office spaces and spoke in calm, precise tones. No one ever looked at him twice. Investigators began to watch him quietly. Unmarked cars at corners. Agents following his commute. He seemed ordinary, too ordinary, but the phone record said otherwise. The calls to the victims came from burner phones. Each one traced back to towers near his home, near his office, near the route he drove every day. Still, they needed proof, not just coincidence. One night, a surveillance officer saw him drop a pizza box into a public trash can. They waited, collected it, sent it to the lab. DNA from the crust matched the hair found on the burlap used to wrap one of the victims. After 13 years, the case finally had a face. When the arrest came, it was quiet. Plainclothes officers waited outside his home. He stepped out, holding a briefcase. They called his name once. He turned and froze. The handcuffs clicked like metal punctuation at the end of a sentence. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. They said he always waved, always kept his yard trimmed. They never saw anything strange, except the way his basement light stayed on deep into the night. Inside that basement, detectives found what they had feared. Weapons stacked in rows. Boxes of ammunition. Maps. Files. Drawings of houses near the beach. Search history darker than anyone wanted to read aloud. The news broke within hours. Long Island's secret was a man who built offices by day and kept trophies by night. The photographs filled every channel. The quiet architect, now a name tied to death. Families of the victims gathered again. They cried and prayed and waited for answers. The sea breeze felt lighter that evening, but no one called it closure. It was only the start of another long chapter. In court, he stood tall, expression still calm. He said nothing. Lawyers spoke for him. The judge ordered him held without bail. Reporters filled the hallway. Flashes burst like lightning against stone walls. Outside the courthouse, mothers held pictures of their daughters. Some whispered, "Thank you." Others whispered, "Why?" Detectives who had retired years earlier came to watch. They nodded quietly, knowing the chase was finally giving way to justice. The ocean still moves the same way it did that first winter, slow and endless. But the name Rex Hoyerman now floats above every wave. A reminder that monsters can wear clean shirts and carry blueprints. The story is not over. Evidence is still being sorted. The trial is yet to come. And somewhere beyond the surf, another secret might still be waiting. The boxes came in waves. Brown cardboard stacked along the wall of the evidence room, each one sealed and dated with care. Inside were years of fragments that never made sense until now. Detectives laid them out like puzzle pieces across long metal tables. Photos, fibers, phone records, receipts. Things that once looked ordinary now spoke in quiet confession. There were burner phones purchased under false names, each one used for a handful of calls, then discarded. Every signal traced to the same cell towers shadowing his commute. Morning trains to Manhattan, evening returns to Massapequa. The pattern drew a perfect loop around his life. There were searches on his computer that chilled the room. Phrases too dark to repeat. Lists of victims, ages, hair color, body type. He had studied them like blueprints. He had built his crimes the same way he designed buildings. Measured, patient, methodical. The DNA was the spine that held it all together. A single hair recovered from the burlap of one victim, matched to his wife at first, but she was out of state when each woman disappeared. The strand carried transfer DNA from shared brushes and towels. The profile led investigators straight back to him. Then came the pizza crust. The crust that changed everything. Simple, ordinary, thrown away on a city sidewalk. It carried a genetic fingerprint that mirrored the one left beneath the burlap. Science did what years of searching could not. Inside his home, they found hundreds of files, some printed, some digital, maps of Long Island, satellite images of remote access roads, lists of escort ads marked with small stars, each star a potential victim that never knew she was being watched. There were guns, so many guns. The basement looked like an armory, each weapon cataloged, serial numbers cross-checked. None of it connected directly to the murders, but together it painted a portrait of obsession. Detectives also uncovered phone calls made to the families after the disappearances. Cruel calls, taunting voices. Tracing those calls led again to the same neighborhoods near his route. They were not proof in themselves, but each one added a brick to the wall surrounding him. The prosecution began to shape the story piece by piece. They spoke of timelines and technology. They spoke of the science that never lies. They called it a case built by patience, not by luck. When the news reached the families, they sat quietly. Some finally smiled through tears. Others refused to celebrate. They had learned not to trust good news until a verdict was written on paper. Experts said it was the first major case to blend old detective work with new DNA algorithms. A modern net catching a man who believed he was invisible. He had lived among them for years, shopping, mowing the lawn, waving at neighbors, all while the evidence grew thicker around him like fog. And yet, even with the match, even with the search history and the maps, detectives still felt a question whispering in their ears. Was he the only one? Could there have been another hand that helped? The files left just enough space for doubt. As the trial date drew closer, boxes of evidence filled another room. Labels lined the shelves, each box carrying a piece of a story that began with 4 bodies in the sand and would end under the cold light of a courtroom. The sea kept rolling outside, waves against the same shoreline that first gave up its secrets. The difference now was that the secret had a name. The courthouse smelled of rain and old wood. Reporters lined the steps before sunrise, cameras waiting like hunters for movement. Inside, the air felt heavy. Every sound echoed longer than it should. Rex Hoyerman entered through a side door, hands cuffed, chest still. His eyes drifted once toward the gallery, then down again. He wore a plain gray suit. Nothing about him suggested the storm that followed. The families sat together in the front rows, photographs of their daughters resting on their laps. Some stared at him without blinking. Others could not lift their heads at all. For them, the trial was not about punishment. It was about understanding why. The prosecution began with calm voices. They told the story of the beach, of the calls and the burlap. They walked the jury through the evidence step by step. The DNA, the phones, the maps, the searches too dark to name aloud. They showed how each detail connected to the next, like threads crossing over and tightening into a single shape. They spoke of patience, of detectives who refused to forget, of science that waited quietly for technology to catch up. The defense countered with questions. They said the evidence was circumstantial, that hair could travel through shared homes, that digital trails could be copied or planted. They asked the jury to remember, doubt is the heart of justice. Experts took the stand one by one. Forensic analysts, cell data specialists, each describing lines and signals that turned invisible air into proof. Some jurors took notes, others simply watched the man in the gray suit. He rarely moved. He blinked slowly, as if each word floated past without landing. Outside the courtroom, the crowd changed daily. Students, retired detectives, tourists with phones raised for pictures. They said the case had become more than crime. It had become a mirror held up to the way people trust faces that seem ordinary. Weeks passed. Testimonies piled high. The courtroom rhythm turned slow and steady, each day beginning with oaths and ending with silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. Just the scrape of chairs and the rustle of paper. Then came the photographs. Grainy images of sand and burlap. The jury leaned forward. The mothers closed their eyes. The prosecutor spoke softly. He said these were not statistics. They were women who had names and laughter and plans. Reporters filled every page, every feed. True crime followers watched each clip. They argued online about guilt, about motive, about justice. But inside that wooden room, the noise could not reach. When closing arguments arrived, the prosecutor said it was never one mistake that caught him. It was every small detail gathered by people who cared too much to stop. He asked the jury to listen to the silence between the facts, because silence sometimes tells the truth louder than words. The defense asked for mercy, for patience, for fairness. They said the world already decided who he was before hearing a verdict. They said, suspicion is not guilt, and guilt is not proof. The judge dismissed them for deliberation. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Rain came again, beating softly against the windows. People stood outside holding umbrellas and hope. No verdict yet, only waiting, only the same question rolling through the crowd. Will the truth finally hold? Will the sand ever stay still? Inside his cell that night, Rex Hoyerman sat alone. The hum of fluorescent light above him, the same gray calm that carried him through the trial. Maybe he wondered when everything had begun to fall apart. Maybe he wondered how long the sea could keep secrets. The world waited for a sentence, but the story was not finished. Because justice, even when close, still takes its time. Morning came with quiet light over the courthouse roof. The crowd had grown smaller, but the air still carried a tremor. Reporters sat up early, waiting for a decision that might come today. Inside the hall, every footstep felt loud enough to echo across years. The jury entered, faces pale and tired. They did not look at anyone as they passed. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. A whisper followed, guilty on all counts. For a second, the room stopped breathing. Somebody cried out, then covered their mouth. Others held hands like people gripping the edge of a storm. The mothers closed their eyes. The prosecutor lowered his head, and the man in the gray suit stood still as stone. The sentence was read slow. Life without parole. No chance of walking the beach again. No more trains to Manhattan. No more blueprints and quiet commutes. Outside the courthouse, bells rang from a church nearby. Reporters spoke into microphones, repeating the word justice again and again. But justice is a strange thing. It fills the space for a moment, then drifts away like smoke. Gilgo Beach returned to its rhythm. Waves still rolled in. Children still built sandcastles. But anyone who knew the story walked slower past the dunes. They looked at the tall grass and thought of the 4 names carved in stone. Detectives who worked the case visited on anniversaries. They left small shells near the memorial cross. Each one carried a piece of the years they spent chasing ghosts. They said the hardest part was not finding him. It was learning how to stop looking once he was found. Rex Hoyerman was moved to a state facility, a cell with no windows, facing the sea. Guards said he spoke rarely, mostly read. Sometimes stood at the wall like he was measuring something that no longer existed. For the families, closure was a word they avoided. They preferred to call it survival. They met each year on the sand, lit candles that flickered against the wind, spoke softly to the names written in chalk before the tide erased them. Tourists who heard the story still come to see the place. They stand at the fence line, take a photo, whisper about the killer, but the locals simply nod and keep walking. They have learned the beach is patient. It keeps memories beneath its surface. And every time the tide shifts a little more, truth rises through the grains. Years will pass. The case will live in documentaries, in podcasts, in the quiet corners of the internet. But for those who lived it, the sound that stays is the ocean. Endless, restless, never silent. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another story waits. Because crime does not end, it only changes its name. If you have followed this far, thank you. Stay with us. New stories are already waiting in the dark corners of quiet towns. Subscribe so you never miss the next long walk into the truth.